someone should handle the delivery worker. I believe you're making a mistake.
The merger cannot proceed without the trustee's authorization.
What trustee?
He controls the deciding vote.
Then perhaps we should review the missing documents first. Can someone explain this number?
It's only a preliminary estimate.
$310 million is a very specific, didn't you? You already calculated the...
A board seat, $5 million, and a foundation in your name. All this ends tonight. Everyone wins. All you have to do is sign.
Can any of this be written into the official record? Then it was never meant for the workers.
Let's finish this vote. We've wasted enough time.
The trust's full voting authority belongs to him.
That's impossible.
Then let's decide what kind of company survives today.
When Elias Booker stepped into the Hawthorne Meridian boardroom and extended his hand to CEO Bennett Hawthorne, Bennett glanced at the outstretched hand, stepped back, and told his assistant to remove the delivery worker. No one laughed, but no one spoke. Elias withdrew his hand without a word, walked to the chair at the far end of the table, and opened a gray folder. 10 minutes later, the lead attorney announced that the $3 billion merger could only proceed if Elias signed the authorization documents. When Bennett understood that the man he had just dismissed controlled the deciding vote, the entire room went silent. If you believe respect has nothing to do with rank, stay with Elias as he turns the table on power. The morning that would change everything arrived cold and overcast in Chicago, the kind of gray November sky that made the steel towers along Michigan Avenue look heavier than usual, and inside the Hawthorne Meridian headquarters, at 42 floors above street level, the executive floor had been arranged with the precision of a ceremony. Investment bankers from 3 firms occupied one side of the hall, their assistants carrying document cases and speaking in low, careful voices. Corporate attorneys reviewed signature packets and flagged pages with colored tabs, each representing a clause worth tens of millions of dollars. The financial press had been invited to wait in the lobby and promised a statement after the preliminary signing, which Bennett Hawthorne expected to take no longer than 90 minutes. Security personnel had been briefed, catering had arrived, and the guest list had been reviewed 3 times. As far as Bennett was concerned, the acquisition of Aldercrest Grid Systems was already complete. This gathering was simply the formality of making it official. Bennett Hawthorne III had spent the better part of 2 years assembling this deal, and he walked through his own headquarters that morning with the particular confidence of a man who had never seriously been told no. He was 52 years old, the 4th consecutive member of his family to lead the company his great-grandfather had founded, and he wore that inheritance the way he wore his suits, deliberately, carefully, and as a statement of authority. The Hawthorne name meant something in industrial finance, and Bennett understood his responsibility to that name as a weight that justified almost everything he had ever done. The Aldercrest acquisition would make Hawthorne Meridian one of the 3 largest smart grid infrastructure companies in the country, and Bennett had already begun quietly telling people that the deal would define his legacy. Elias Booker arrived alone, with no assistant and no entourage, carrying a worn leather briefcase and wearing a charcoal vest over a simple gray suit that showed no label and announced nothing. He had come directly from a meeting with workers at the Aldercrest manufacturing plant in Michigan, where he had spent the previous evening sitting around a folding table, listening to men and women talk about the mortgages they were carrying and the pensions they had been paying into for decades. The transition from that conversation to the marble lobby of Hawthorne Meridian headquarters was not something Elias allowed himself to think about too carefully, because if he did, he would have found it harder to remain patient. The receptionist at the front desk did not locate his name on the primary guest register because someone in Bennett's office had placed him under a secondary category marked Labor Representatives, a designation that carried no photo badge and no escort to the main boardroom. When Elias eventually entered the room, he moved through the gathered executives and attorneys toward the head of the table, where Bennett stood speaking to a senior banker, and he extended his hand with the quiet, practiced courtesy of someone who understood that first impressions often mattered more than anything said afterward. Bennett looked at him for approximately 2 seconds, long enough to take in the age of the briefcase, the absence of a name badge from any recognized firm, and the absence of anyone flanking Elias to explain who he was. Then Bennett turned to his chief of staff and said, in a voice just low enough to be deniable, that someone should take care of the delivery situation. Several executives near enough to hear the remark exchanged glances but said nothing, because there was no version of intervening that did not also involve becoming the person who embarrassed Bennett Hawthorne in his own boardroom. Elias withdrew his hand without a word, walked to the far end of the table where a small printed card bore his name. Elias Booker, Independent Trustee, Aldercrest Workers Stewardship Trust, and sat down with the calm of a man who had been told worse things by more powerful people and had still been in the room when they were no longer. He opened his folder and did not look up. Catherine Winthrop, the 61-year-old chairwoman of Aldercrest's board, arrived 3 minutes later, crossed the room with the unhurried authority of someone who had chaired more difficult meetings than this one, and greeted Elias by name, and with her hand extended, which he accepted. She took the seat beside him and set her own materials on the table without ceremony. Naomi Pierce, the Trust's lead counsel, opened the formal portion of the meeting by distributing a one-page summary that most people in the room had never seen before, because most people in the room had not bothered to read the underlying governance structure of the trust they were about to become obligated to. The Aldercrest Workers Stewardship Trust held 28% of Aldercrest Grid Systems voting shares, she explained, and under the terms established during the company's financial restructuring 14 years earlier, any transaction involving the transfer of controlling interest required the written authorization of the trust's independent trustee, specifically his notarized signature on the final acquisition documents. Without that signature, no transaction involving more than $1 billion in company value could be considered legally executed. The room absorbed this information with varying expressions of surprise, confusion, and, in at least 2 cases, something close to alarm. Bennett recovered faster than most people in the room, because Bennett had spent a lifetime learning to recover quickly in public, but the speed of his recovery did not hide what had briefly crossed his face. He offered a brief remark about a scheduling mix-up and said something about being grateful to have all the relevant parties at the table, which was the kind of thing a man says when he is too proud to offer a real apology and too aware of his surroundings to offer nothing at all. Elias acknowledged the statement without responding to it, picked up a page from his folder, and asked in the flat, precise tone of someone who had already identified the central problem, before sitting down, why the Labor Impact Annex had not been included in the document package provided to the trust. Bennett said the annex was a preliminary document and not yet relevant to the authorization process. Elias closed his folder, placed both hands on top of it, and told the room that he would not be signing anything until he had seen it. The explanation Naomi Pierce offered to the room was not complicated, but it was the kind of history that powerful people preferred not to think about. 14 years earlier, Aldercrest Grid Systems had been weeks away from insolvency after a capital shortage left the company unable to service its construction debt on 3 major transmission projects. The board at the time had faced a choice between selling at a severe loss to an outside buyer or accepting a restructuring proposal that gave employees a meaningful stake in the company's future in exchange for deferred wages and pension contributions being redirected into a bridge fund. The workers had voted for the restructuring by a wide margin, not because they fully understood every clause in the agreement, but because they trusted the company they had built with 20 and 30 years of their working lives, and they had taken a risk that a healthier company would eventually be worth protecting. The trust that emerged from that restructuring held 28% of Aldercrest's voting shares and was designed specifically to prevent a scenario in which the company's recovery would one day be used to eliminate the very workers whose sacrifices had made it possible. An independent trustee was required, precisely because the board could not be allowed to adjudicate disputes between its own financial interests and the interests of labor. Elias had been selected because he was one of the few people with the credentials and the documented independence to hold that position credibly. He had no personal investment in Aldercrest's stock price and no financial relationship with any of the acquiring parties. His authority was not a courtesy, and it was not a title bestowed on him because someone liked him. It was a contractual requirement, built into the governance structure of the trust, and legally binding on anyone who wanted to do business with the company. Bennett listened to this summary, with the expression of a man hearing an explanation of a problem he had been told would not exist. Hawthorne Meridian's legal team had reviewed the basic outline of the trust structure, but the specific threshold requiring trustee authorization had apparently been flagged as a procedural formality by someone who had not read far enough into the agreement to understand that a procedural formality with a veto attached to it was not a formality at all. That gap in preparation now sat in the middle of Bennett's timeline like a structural fault. He needed at least 67% of Aldercrest's total voting shares to reach the approval threshold for the acquisition, and without the trust's 28%, he could not reach it regardless of how many smaller shareholders had already committed. The math was simple and the math was brutal, and it meant that the man Bennett had just attempted to remove from the room was the single most important person in it. Bennett's immediate response was to propose what he understood to be the most direct solution to most problems of this kind. He offered to increase the acquisition price by $50 million, framing it as a gesture of good faith toward the workforce, and suggesting that the additional consideration could be distributed through the trust to its beneficiaries. He said this in the smooth, confident way of someone who had solved things with money before and expected that solving things with money was universally available as a technique. Elias looked at him for a moment without expression and said that a $50 million increase in the transaction price, distributed across the current workforce, would amount to roughly $15,000 per employee before taxes, which would not replace the income of someone who lost a job, would not make up the shortfall in a pension that had been restructured away, and would not fund a child's education or a mortgage payment for longer than a few months. He said it without sarcasm as a statement of arithmetic, and then he set the offer aside. Gavin Sloan, Hawthorne Meridian's chief financial officer, entered the conversation with the carefully managed tone of a man who had anticipated this particular obstacle and had prepared several ways around it. He explained that the personnel planning component of the acquisition was still in development, and that final workforce decisions would be made in consultation with the new combined leadership structure after the merger was complete. Elias turned to a specific page in the financial disclosure package that had been provided to the trust and pointed to a line item in the restructuring reserve section. The figure was $310 million, a number that appeared under the category of transition cost allocation and carried no detailed explanation. Elias said that $310 million was a very specific number to have reserved for a workforce transition that was still undecided, and that the only scenario in which such a figure made mathematical sense was one in which the company had already calculated the severance cost for a known number of positions. The temperature in the room had changed without anyone adjusting the climate controls. Bennett had not expected this level of preparation from someone he had dismissed before the meeting began, and the shift in his expression from dismissal to something harder was visible to anyone watching closely enough. Catherine Winthrop asked Sloan directly whether the labor annex existed in complete form, and Sloan said it was still being finalized. And Catherine said she was giving his team 24 hours to produce it in a form the trust could review. After the formal session ended, Bennett caught Elias in the corridor and made an effort to soften what had happened in the boardroom, offering an explanation about the confusion at the door and saying he hoped it had not colored the discussion. He told Elias he did not look like someone managing a decision of that scale, and seemed to believe the observation was a reasonable one. Elias said that was precisely why Bennett needed to revisit the way he assessed people and walked toward the elevator without waiting for a response. That evening, Gavin Sloan sent a message to an unidentified number that read simply, "If Booker still has his vote by Friday, this deal is dead." The article appeared the next morning on a financial news aggregator with a headline describing an activist attorney who was allegedly holding a $3 billion acquisition hostage to extract personal leverage over the combined company's leadership structure. The piece cited unnamed sources inside Hawthorne Meridian and described Elias as someone with a history of adversarial relationships with corporate leadership, referencing a lawsuit that had ended his partnership at a major law firm, without mentioning that the lawsuit had been filed by workers whose pension funds Elias had refused to help his firm's client conceal. The article was precisely constructed, factually selective enough to be difficult to dispute, inflammatory enough to shift the frame of the story from a trustee reviewing a contract to a single individual blocking progress for personal reasons. 3 networks picked it up within 4 hours, and by noon there were camera crews outside the offices of the Aldercrest Workers Stewardship Trust. Bennett appeared in a brief television interview that afternoon and said he respected the role of labor representatives in transactions of this scale, but that the process could not be allowed to be disrupted by any single individual's desire for expanded personal authority. He spoke with the measured warmth of a man performing reasonableness, and he used the word process 4 times without once mentioning what he had said in the boardroom 2 days earlier, or the fact that the independent trustee he was describing as a disruptive individual was contractually required to be there. A number of smaller Aldercrest shareholders, watching their holdings decline as the uncertainty dragged on, began directing their frustration toward the figure the press had made convenient to blame. A financial analyst on a morning broadcast said the situation raised questions about whether worker governance structures created genuine instability in major corporate transactions, which was the kind of thing people said when they wanted to change a policy, without appearing to oppose workers directly. Elias did not appear on any broadcast, did not release a statement, and did not ask anyone to defend him publicly. He sat in his office at a small desk, covered in financial documents, and continued to read them, because reading them was what he had been appointed to do, and because the story being constructed about him in the press would either hold up against what was in the documents or it would not. Tessa Monroe reached him through a personal message channel on the second evening after the article appeared, using an account that was not connected to her Hawthorne Meridian credentials, and she wrote 3 sentences that changed the shape of everything Elias had been building toward. She told him the Labor Impact Annex had existed in complete form for at least 7 months, that it had been attached to every internal planning document circulated above the vice president level at Hawthorne Meridian, and that it contained workforce reduction projections for 3,200 positions across 2 facilities, including both plants that Bennett had publicly promised to keep open during the announcement of the acquisition the previous spring. Elias asked her not to transfer any files, not to photograph documents, and not to do anything through the internal system that could be characterized as unauthorized access. He explained the formal whistleblower reporting process that applied to publicly traded companies involved in material misrepresentation during merger negotiations, outlined the specific protections it afforded her under securities law, and told her that if the information she had described was accurate, the right avenue would protect her better than anything informal could. Tessa took 24 hours to consider it, and then she submitted her report through the correct channel, attaching her own account with timestamps and document references from her work history that she was legally entitled to provide. Inside the trust, the pressure was coming from a different direction. Russell Dane, a board member who had spent 18 years as a union coordinator at one of the Aldercrest facilities, called for an emergency session and argued that if the acquisition failed because of Elias's refusal to authorize it, the company might not survive the resulting financial shortfall, and the workers whose interests the trust was supposed to protect would end up with nothing rather than an uncertain something. His argument was not unreasonable on its face, and it was delivered in the voice of a man who appeared genuinely alarmed, and it moved several of the other board members, in ways that Sloan had calculated it would. Russell proposed a formal vote to restrict Elias's autonomous authority over the trust's shares, and a date was set for the following week. Naomi Pierce told Elias that night that someone had engineered the timing, and that the opposition to him inside the trust had not assembled itself independently. Elias agreed to hold the vote anyway, because he believed that a trustee who prevented people from questioning him had already failed at the job. He told Naomi that if the board members wanted to limit his authority, and they did so through the proper process, he would accept the outcome. But he needed to know first whether Russell Dane had been in contact with anyone from Hawthorne Meridian. The answer arrived in the form of a forwarded message that one of the other board members had received by accident. A photograph of Russell Dane and Gavin Sloan at a members-only club 3 blocks from the Hawthorne Meridian offices, taken 4 days before Russell had called for the emergency session. Elias did not confront Russell Dane in front of the full board, because a confrontation in front of the full board would have turned what was a matter of governance into a spectacle, and a spectacle would have handed Sloan exactly the kind of disorder he was counting on. Instead, Elias arrived early to the board meeting, found Russell alone in the anteroom, and asked him a single question: whether Gavin Sloan had made any financial offer or personal assurance in connection with the emergency vote. Russell denied it immediately, and with the specific kind of energy that appears in people who are telling the truth about the part of the question they are answering, while leaving the harder part unanswered. The other board members, arriving one by one and catching the edge of the exchange, found reasons to slow their entry, and by the time everyone was seated, the room had the specific quality of a space in which something had already shifted before the formal proceedings began. Naomi called for a conflict of interest review before the vote could proceed, citing the photograph and the undisclosed meeting, and under the trust's bylaws the review had to be completed before any member with a potential conflict could participate in a vote affecting the trust's core governance. The motion to proceed with the original vote was tabled. Into that pause, the formal documents that Tessa had submitted through the whistleblower process began to arrive at the offices of the independent auditors assigned to review her claim, and what they described was not an incomplete plan or a preliminary projection, but a fully developed operational roadmap that had been written, revised, approved, and deliberately kept away from the parties who had the right to see it. The Labor Impact Annex ran to 47 pages, and it was specific in the way that documents are specific when the people who write them are confident no one outside a small circle will ever read them. Within 6 months of the acquisition's completion, 2 Aldercrest manufacturing facilities were to be closed, and their operations consolidated into a smaller single-site operation, eliminating 3,200 positions. The pension obligations currently held by Aldercrest, representing retirement security for thousands of current and former employees, were to be transferred to a newly created subsidiary, capitalized at a fraction of what would be required to cover the actual liability, effectively parking a multi-hundred-million-dollar obligation in an entity that could declare insolvency without implicating the parent company. 7 energy technology patents developed by Aldercrest engineers over the previous decade were to be transferred to a Delaware-registered holding entity before the formal close of the merger, removing them from the combined company's balance sheet and placing them beyond the reach of any labor agreement. The executive compensation package written into the final deal included a performance bonus structure that would pay Bennett Hawthorne and 5 senior executives a combined total of $140 million in the 18 months following the acquisition. Catherine Winthrop read the annex in the boardroom of the Aldercrest offices, while Naomi sat across from her and said nothing. And by the time Catherine set the last page down, the expression on her face was the particular stillness of someone processing the distance between what she had been told and what was true. She said she had never seen this document. She said it had never been presented to Aldercrest's board. She said that what she had understood to be a negotiated acquisition with labor protection provisions was, in the form it had actually been designed, something closer to a structured extraction of value. Bennett, reached by telephone that afternoon, said he was aware of the broad strokes of the restructuring plan, but that the specific operational details had been the work of his financial team, and he had relied on their expertise to manage the implementation side. Naomi, on Elias's instruction, pulled the internal budget authorization documents from the records Tessa had referenced, and she found what Elias had expected to find: a digital signature on the restructuring budget approval that matched Bennett's authorized credentials, applied to a document that included the annex's projected workforce reduction costs as a line item, time-stamped 8 months earlier. Bennett had not been kept in the dark by Sloan. He had reviewed the plan, signed off on the budget that funded it, and then arranged a public posture that would allow him to say he had not known the details. The dinner Bennett had requested with Elias was held at a private room in a restaurant where the prices were kept off the printed menu, and Bennett arrived with the affect of a man attempting to negotiate from a position he believed still had value. He outlined 3 options: a seat on the post-merger board, a consulting contract valued at $5 million, and a philanthropic fund to be established in Elias's name, with a $10 million endowment for workforce development, all contingent on Elias signing the documents as written and agreeing to allow executive management to handle workforce transition decisions without trustee oversight. Elias listened to all 3 offers without interrupting, and when Bennett finished, he asked whether any of these arrangements would be memorialized in official meeting minutes where they could be reviewed by the Trust's board. Bennett understood in the silence that followed that the question was not a request for clarification. Elias said he had no interest in having his name on a building funded with money that should have been in workers' retirement accounts, and he set his napkin on the table and told Bennett he would see him on Friday. That night, someone with administrative-level access to the Hawthorne Meridian internal document system deleted the folder containing the labor annex from the shared server, and Tessa Monroe received notification that she had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into unauthorized disclosure of confidential company information. The mechanism Sloan invoked was buried deep in the Trust's founding charter, in a passage addressing the removal of a trustee whose actions demonstrably reduced the market value of the Trust's holdings in ways that could not be justified by any reasonable interpretation of fiduciary obligation. Aldercrest's stock had declined 12% since the acquisition announcement had stalled, and Sloan's legal team filed a formal notice arguing that Elias's refusal to authorize the transaction constituted exactly this kind of demonstrable harm. The argument was not airtight. A trustee reviewing documents for potential fraud was not obviously the same as a trustee engaging in value destruction, but it did not need to be airtight in order to do what it was designed to do, which was introduce enough procedural uncertainty to give Russell's motion new momentum and force a vote before Friday's scheduled shareholder session. Russell stepped forward as the proposed replacement trustee for the purpose of casting the Trust's vote, presenting himself as a practical solution that would allow the acquisition to proceed and protect the jobs that a deal collapse would put at risk. He made this argument to the other board members in a meeting that Elias attended in silence, and the argument had real weight because the possibility that Aldercrest might not survive the financial strain of a failed acquisition was not a manufactured fear. The company's cash position was under genuine pressure, and everyone at the table understood that. The workers who would lose pensions in a bankruptcy were real people, and Russell named several of them, and their names sat in the room like evidence. Several board members said they were struggling to disagree with Russell's position, while also feeling that something about the situation was not quite right. Elias proposed a different approach. He arranged a public meeting at the Aldercrest plant in Michigan, in the main assembly hall, with no advance approval from Hawthorne Meridian's communications team and no curated press access. He stood on the floor level, not on a stage, and told the workers assembled there that he was not going to pretend the situation was simple. He said Aldercrest genuinely needed capital and that the acquisition was not worthless. The company had real operational weaknesses, and a deal with the right protections could address them in ways that internal management had not been able to. He said the version of the deal that had been put in front of him was not that deal, and he read them the specific provisions he had found. The plant closures, the pension transfer structure, the patent reallocation, and he told them that he could not sign a document containing those terms without betraying the only thing his position existed to protect. He did not promise he could save every job. He said he could promise he would not pretend they had been protected when they had not. Some workers told him directly that he was gambling with their lives for the sake of a principle, and he stood and listened to those words without deflecting them, because they were not entirely wrong, and he had earned them by making a decision that affected people who had no choice but to trust him. Tessa Monroe appeared at the meeting with her own attorney and made a brief public statement, confirming that the documents she had submitted through the whistleblower process were accurate, and that the deletion of the server file had occurred through a system account linked to the office of the Chief Financial Officer. Sloan responded through a public statement calling Elias and Tessa co-conspirators in a coordinated effort to depress Aldercrest's stock price, and Naomi spent the following morning demonstrating to a meeting of independent financial auditors that Elias held no tradable position in Aldercrest stock and no financial relationship with any entity that could benefit from a price decline, which made the allegation arithmetically impossible to sustain. Catherine Winthrop, reviewing the financial structure of the acquisition with a new level of scrutiny, discovered a document that had not been included in any of the materials shared with Aldercrest's board. A credit facility agreement between Hawthorne Meridian and a syndicated lending group that used Aldercrest's 7 clean energy patents as collateral for a line of credit that Bennett had drawn on 4 months before the shareholder vote had taken place. The lenders had accepted the patents as security based on the assumption that the acquisition was a done deal, which meant that Bennett had borrowed against assets he did not yet own and had committed to delivering them to creditors before anyone at Aldercrest had agreed to let them go. The discovery meant that the transaction was not simply structured in ways that harmed workers. It was structured around a certainty of outcome that its architects had never intended to risk on an actual vote. Russell Dane, sitting in Naomi's office 2 days before the scheduled vote, acknowledged that Gavin Sloan had offered to retire the medical debt his wife had incurred over the previous 3 years, which amounted to more than $200,000, and had promised him a position on the advisory board of the newly combined company. He said he had not accepted either offer, but that he had agreed to share internal information about the trust's deliberations in exchange for a promise that would never have been honored. He said he was sorry, and he seemed to mean it, and Elias did not publicly humiliate him or ask anyone else to. He asked Russell to recuse himself from all trust decisions related to the acquisition and to provide a written account to the independent auditors, and Russell agreed to both without negotiating the terms. Naomi, reviewing the trust's charter that same evening, found the provision she had suspected was there. When credible evidence of outside influence on a board member's vote had been established, all voting authority reverted automatically to the independent trustee for the duration of the relevant transaction. Elias was now carrying the full 28% of Aldercrest's voting shares alone. The shareholder vote was held on a Friday in a building with floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Chicago River, in a room configured to hold more people than it usually needed to, because everyone involved understood that what happened inside it would be treated as the culmination of something that had been building for 2 weeks. Investment bank representatives occupied the back rows along one wall, carrying prepared statements for both the approval and rejection scenarios. Legal teams sat in clusters arranged by client, and the journalists permitted inside. A small pool from the financial press, set up along a gallery railing. Bennett Hawthorne arrived through the front entrance, which he had not used in years because the front entrance meant walking past photographers. And walking past photographers on a morning when he expected to announce the largest acquisition in his company's history felt like the appropriate scale of the occasion. He was confident. He had spent the previous 72 hours securing commitments from smaller shareholders who had grown tired of waiting, and he had done his arithmetic carefully and believed he had enough votes to reach the 67% threshold, even under conservative assumptions. He crossed the room toward Elias before the session was called to order, a gesture he had not made voluntarily in any of their previous encounters, and said that he hoped both of them could approach the morning without letting personal history make a complicated process more complicated than it needed to be. Elias said he had always understood it as a business matter, not a personal one, and Bennett nodded as though this satisfied him, which was the nod of a man who needed to believe something and had decided to act as if he did. Sloan presented the preliminary voting tally from the advance commitments, which showed Hawthorne Meridian at 63% of the required threshold with remaining shares outstanding. He called on the trust's representative to cast its 28%. Russell Dane's name was announced for that purpose. Naomi Pierce was on her feet before the second syllable of his surname finished echoing, and she submitted the conflict of interest documentation, the written account Russell had provided to the auditors, and the specific language from the trust's charter. The provision stating that when credible evidence of outside influence on a board member's vote had been established, all voting authority reverted automatically to the independent trustee. The independent legal examiner brought in for the session reviewed the provision and the documentation for 11 minutes, which felt considerably longer than 11 minutes to most of the people in the room, and then confirmed that the provision applied, and that the full 28% of Aldercrest's voting shares were under Elias Booker's sole authority. Bennett looked at Sloan with the expression of a man asking a question that had no useful answer. Elias did not exercise the vote immediately. He asked for the meeting to hear a segment of audio from a recorded internal planning session, specifying that the recording had been made through the standard corporate archival system under routine legal hold procedures and was not a private intercept. In the recording, Sloan's voice described the land value opportunity created by closing a manufacturing facility in a secondary market, noting that a related entity had already positioned itself to acquire the devalued real estate at favorable prices. A second voice, identified by the session's metadata as belonging to Bennett Hawthorne, said the market would recover quickly from the loss of a few thousand positions once the profit numbers materialized. The recording ran for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and no one in the room said anything during any of it. Tessa Monroe, appearing by video connection with her attorney present, presented the document revision history she had preserved through the formal disclosure process, which showed that the Labor Impact Annex had been removed from the file package sent to Aldercrest's board representatives on a date that preceded the formal start of due diligence by 3 weeks. Someone had decided, deliberately and with knowledge of the review timeline, that the document the trust was entitled to see should not be in the package the trust received. Catherine Winthrop stood and formally requested that the vote be suspended pending an independent forensic audit and a review of the credit facility Bennett had structured using Aldercrest's patents as collateral without board authorization. Bennett said suspending the vote would be catastrophic for Aldercrest's liquidity position and that the company had approximately 90 days of operating runway before its cash position became critical. Elias said that was accurate, and that it was precisely why he had spent the previous 2 weeks trying to find a version of the transaction that solved Aldercrest's capital problem without functioning the way the current version was designed to function. He said his goal had never been to destroy the acquisition. His goal had been to prevent a transaction structured as a legitimate merger from operating as an extraction of value from the people least able to protect themselves. He outlined the modified terms he was prepared to authorize. Both manufacturing facilities to remain operational for a minimum of 3 years under binding agreement. Pension obligations to be held in a fully capitalized independent trust rather than transferred to an underfunded subsidiary. A joint labor management oversight board with real authority over workforce decisions. The executive bonus structure to be eliminated in its current form. An independent investigation of Sloan and Bennett's conduct in connection with the annex and the credit facility, and formal whistleblower protection guarantees for Tessa Monroe and anyone else who had participated in the disclosure process. He gave Hawthorne Meridian's board 2 hours to accept the modified terms or receive a negative vote. Sloan leaned toward Bennett and said, just audibly enough to reach the nearest ears, that without the patent transfer and the bonus structure, the financing syndicate, holding the credit facility, would withdraw its commitment, and the entire transaction would collapse. The Hawthorne Meridian board retreated to a side room and remained there for 1 hour and 47 minutes, and the quality of the silence that came from behind those doors was the quality of a silence in which people are discovering how much they did not know about what they had been part of. Several board members had been told, in various forms and at various times, that the acquisition was straightforward, well-structured, and had been designed to protect value across both organizations. They were now in possession of a recording, a document revision history, an unauthorized credit facility, and a whistleblower account, all of which described something else entirely. 3 of them sent for their personal attorneys before the session resumed. Catherine Winthrop, representing Aldercrest's interests in the adjoining room, told the Hawthorne Meridian representatives that her board intended to file a claim for fraudulent misrepresentation in merger negotiations if the modified terms were rejected, and that the documentation to support that claim was already organized and in the hands of Aldercrest's outside counsel. The financing syndicate, which had by this point received a summary of the audio recording and the patent collateral issue through its own counsel, sent word that it was reviewing its position and would not commit to continued participation in the current transaction structure, pending legal clarification. The room in which Sloan had constructed his plan over 18 months collapsed, not from outside attack, but from the weight of what it had been built to conceal. The board voted. Bennett Hawthorne was suspended from his executive role, pending the outcome of an independent investigation into his authorization of the restructuring budget, his approval of the patent collateral credit facility without board notification, and his knowledge of and participation in the decision to withhold the labor annex from the trust's review. Gavin Sloan was referred to the relevant regulatory authority for investigation into document concealment, inducement of a board member through undisclosed financial promises, and potential violations related to the unauthorized use of corporate assets as loan collateral. The bonus structure was voided. The modified transaction terms were adopted as the governing framework for the acquisition, and the vote was scheduled for the following week, under the new conditions. Elias cast the trust's 28% in favor of the modified acquisition. When asked by a reporter outside the building why he had not voted against it, why, given everything Bennett had done, he had not chosen to exercise the one form of power that would have definitively ended the transaction, he said that several thousand people were depending on Aldercrest's continued operation, and that they had not agreed to become instruments of his personal grievance. He said the test of why he had been given this authority was not what he did with it when he was winning. It was what he refused to do with it when doing so would have felt satisfying. Bennett found him in the corridor during the break between the formal vote and the press statement, and there were no cameras present and no attorneys monitoring the exchange. He said Elias had spent 2 weeks using a social mistake to dismantle a business deal he had spent years constructing, and there was enough bitterness in his voice that the words came out smaller than he intended. Elias said the moment at the door had not caused any of what followed. It had simply been the first legible evidence of how Bennett operated when he believed the person in front of him held no power over the outcome, and that a leader who makes consequential decisions based on who he thinks matters has already built a catastrophic error into every process that depends on accurate information reaching him. Bennett was quiet for a long moment, and then said that he had known about the workforce reduction plan and had believed at the time that the scale of the gain justified the cost. He did not say this as a defense. He said it as a fact he was willing to state plainly for the first time. Elias said difficult decisions sometimes required accepting genuine trade-offs, but that deception was never a trade-off. It was always a choice, and it was always a choice made by someone who preferred not to be accountable for what they were doing. He left when there was nothing more to say. 6 months after the shareholder session, the acquisition closed at its revised valuation, and the combined entity began operating under the governance structure Elias had required as a condition of his authorization. The 2 Aldercrest manufacturing facilities remained open, their continued operation protected by a binding commitment included in the final merger agreement and monitored by the Joint Oversight Board that met quarterly with representatives from both management and the Workforce Trust. A retraining program, funded by a portion of the acquisition premium that had been redirected from the executive compensation pool, helped several hundred workers whose roles had been affected by the technology integration transition find positions within the expanded operation rather than outside it. The pension obligations were held in a standalone legal entity with full capitalization, managed by an independent board with no financial relationship to the acquiring company, and audited annually. The terms were not aspirational, they were contractual, and they were monitored by people whose job was to verify that the contract meant what it said. Tessa Monroe was appointed Chief Compliance Officer of the combined organization, a title she accepted with the specific wariness of someone who understood the difference between being rewarded and being given a harder job. She built a disclosure framework that made the kind of selective document management she had witnessed structurally more difficult to execute, and she was told by 3 different people in her first month that she was making things complicated, which she took as evidence she was doing the job correctly. Catherine Winthrop served as transitional chairwoman of the combined board for 18 months before stepping back into an advisory role, and she never publicly characterized what had happened as a near miss, because she understood that near misses are defined by what almost happened, and she preferred to focus on what could still be changed. Russell Dane cooperated fully with the independent investigation, provided complete testimony about his communications with Sloan, and bore the professional consequences of having compromised his independence without having sold it outright. He lost his board seat and the standing it carried among the people who had trusted him, and he knew that no explanation he offered would restore it, because trust is not restored by explanations. He left quietly, and the record of what had happened remained in the investigation files where it belonged. Bennett Hawthorne appeared before the combined company's shareholder committee 8 months after the vote and read a prepared statement he had written himself, without communications staff, which was evident in its plainness. He said he had known about the workforce reduction plan before the formal negotiation process began. He said he had been aware of the decision to exclude the labor annex from the trust's document package and had not objected to it. He said he had assessed Elias Booker at their first meeting using criteria that had nothing to do with Elias's actual authority or qualifications, and everything to do with assumptions he had not examined because he had never been required to. He agreed to return a portion of his accumulated executive compensation from the preceding 3 years to a workforce transition fund under the oversight of the trust, and he signed the documentation in front of the committee without negotiating the terms. After the session, he found Elias alone in the corridor outside the committee room. No cameras, no attorneys, no agenda that either of them needed to manage, and he extended his hand and offered an apology that contained no attached explanation, no qualification, and no request for a particular response. Elias shook his hand. He told Bennett that what this permitted was not the erasure of what had been done, but the possibility of beginning to do something different. Bennett left the building without a title and without a driver, and turned up his collar against the November wind that had come back around exactly as it had been on the morning all of this began. Elias drove to the Aldercrest plant in Michigan the following morning and walked the floor while the new equipment was being installed, and the workers, who had almost lost everything, moved through their stations with the particular purposeful quiet of people who understood how close the ground had come. A young worker on the assembly line asked him what it had felt like to be the one holding the vote on a $3 billion transaction, and Elias thought about it for a moment and said he had never felt like he was holding the power in that room. He said what he had been holding was the right of the people standing in this building to have someone in that room who remembered they existed. On the wall above the main entrance to the plant floor, a printed sheet listed the terms of the merger agreement that applied to the facility, the employment protections, the pension guarantees, the oversight board schedule, in type large enough to read from a distance, exactly as Elias had requested. On the morning Bennett Hawthorne had refused to take his hand, he had decided Elias carried nothing worth acknowledging. By the time that hand was finally taken, it had held together the working lives of thousands of people, had protected the retirement savings they had spent decades building, and had forced a $3 billion institution to keep its word.